Hi everyone, I'm Paula and welcome to SewSpark Studio. Thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be looking at applique, and in particular machine applique using a satin stitch. And so I'll be showing you tips and tricks from doing very simple applique shapes, going around corners and following curves, to more complicated layer shapes and how I put them together. So I hope you'll join me. Let's get started. Just a little explanation of my thought process when I'm designing a more complicated applique. And usually these are for quilt applications. I do a lot of baby quilts, for example, and this one is actually for a wall hanging because I'm in a new sewing space and I have a fairly good sized wall and I want something sewing related, and so a quilted wall hanging is going to suit that really well. So the first thing then I do is find images or draw my images. I might use clip art, and it depends if the clip art is exactly what I want or not. But if it is, I'll copy it into a Word document and then I can make it whatever size I want. But probably I do that less rather than more because I can't find exactly the image that I want. So usually then I will draw my own. And I may use clip art to help me a little bit with proportion or with position, because I'm not a first-class artist. I have some skills, but not what someone who can just, sit down and sketch out of their head. So I did look online. I did use some images for positioning, and then I added my own. And these are hooded mountain tanagers, the color scheme I'm using. And if you're going, how on earth, where did that come from? Well, one day on my computer, the screensaver image that came up was a hooded mountain tanager. And I had been playing around with maybe robins or swallows or something. And I thought, oh, those are pretty colors. And so that's where this came from. The first thing I do is do a scale drawing. And so this was my original drawing here. And every square is 1 inch. And I've actually taped 2 pieces of graph paper together to get this. And this final dimension is going to be 50 inches by 38 inches when I'm done. And then I decided to change the image. And so I didn't draw the whole thing. So I've still got the birds here, but they're working around a sewing machine. So this is a scale drawing. 1 square in this equals 1 inch. Then once I have that, then I need to scale it up to the size that I actually want the finished design. So what I do is use 1 inch graph paper. So I printed it online and I had to tape pieces together. So this is the sewing machine in the actual size it will be on the finished quilt. If it was just for me and I wasn't sharing it and making this accessible for you to download, this is all I would do. But when I do the downloading, I go a step further. So I actually cut this apart. I scanned it. And then I actually go into software. I redraw it. And then I go a step further, because if I was doing it myself, I would have to trace it backwards in order to get the correct orientation of the finished design. But in the software, I can just mirror the image and I can create the backwards images that I need when I'm tracing on the fusing web. So if you're interested in my templates, if you go to my website, sewsparkstudio.com, you will be able to find the templates that I'm using for this. And I'll put a link in the description for this YouTube tutorial as well, so that you can get those if you're interested. There are 2 sets of templates on the site. There is the template that is the birds in the orientation that they will be in the finished design. And I do 2 sets because I use these when I am actually putting together all of the different pieces that make up the design. So these are all the templates for the finished design after it's been appliqued to fabrics. And I'll show you in a bit how I use those. And then I have the reversed templates, which you would use to trace for when you're fusing. For bird number 4, you don't need to do anything with that one. But on the other birds, there is a piece. For example, for this one, it's her hat. You don't need to cut out the design. You're just taking this and cutting the one edge so that you can tape it together. And if you line up the triangles, it should match pretty closely. If it doesn't, you just take a pencil and correct it. So that's bird number 1, and this is number 2. And number 3. And then the sewing machine is in a separate file, and there are 4 pages. And it doesn't necessarily tape together like a lot of patterns that you can get. I didn't try to line up the papers. I just tried to line up the design. So you're going to be looking again to match those triangles to bring each of the pieces together. And there's your finished sewing machine. And again, you're not going to cut these out. However, I do sometimes trim off some of the excess just to make it a little bit easier to work with when I start tracing. I'm using a number of different fabrics, so I can't just trace the whole design. And so I am tracing elements of the design. I have to think about layers and how I'm going to be placing items on this. So my hat is one color. So we'll start by tracing the hat. And even though parts of the hat are going to be covered with other items, I'm going to trace the hat as a complete item. This line here won't actually be cut. And here, this goes underneath her head. So what I would do is I like to layer it when I place it. So this is her headline, but this is where I'm going to cut the piece so that it's going to tuck under her head right there. This is overlapping, so I'm going to leave it like it is, and that I'm going to leave like it is as well. So that's the hat piece. Sometimes I will trace flowers, but for this one, I have this fabric with flowers, and I'm actually going to use cutouts of some of these flowers to decorate her hat with. So I'm not going to trace these at all. I will cut circles of this to fuse onto here for when I'm cutting those out. But I do need parts of the ribbon. So I think I'm going to do them as 2 separate pieces. So again, I have flowers here. So I'm going to extend this ribbon, and I like to mark in the flower line just to give me some guidelines there. And I'm going to just, again, dot in the hat line. And I'm just going to move this over a little bit. And so here's the lines on the piece. This is the outside of it. And I'm going to extend it a little bit. So it's going to be underneath when I actually place it. And then we've got these ribbons here. And again, I'll do a little bit of an extension on that one. And this one's going to be cut separately as well. And then sometimes I will number pieces. Right now I'm just going to work on this one bird, but if I was doing all of them at the same time, I might call them, this is bird number 1, so 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, if I thought I might get confused and forget where pieces went. All right, so now let's go to, and again, I try and place things to make as good a use of the paper as possible too. So this is the face. And this is the beak. And then the eye has 2 colors. There's a red outer circle and a black inner circle. Let's do this wing piece. And the breast piece is going to be under some of these parts. So again, a little bit extra there, and then it actually goes down here. I think we'll probably do this part under as well. And then this part is blue again, and this one is going to go under this. And I think that's all the pieces for this one. So by the way, when you print it, I do have a square, and make sure that you print it at 100%. And if you measure this square, it should measure 1 inch when you're finished. So that's all the pieces for bird 1. So I would do the same thing with each of the birds and also with the sewing machine, because there's a number of pieces that layer on top of each other for all of them. So I'm not going to make you watch me do all of them. We'll just work on this one bird for right now. So this is the basic blue for the body of the bird. And so again, wrong side up. And because the print is all over, I'm not as concerned about how I place the pieces. And so I have 3 pieces on here. Steam turned off on the iron. And then 10 seconds. And again, just a check. Nope, not long enough there. Okay, that's good now. And so you'll do the same for all your pieces. This is the eye. Oops, wrong side. I've done that before. And I'm just using scraps for a lot of these pieces. Most of them actually, I went through my scrap bins because you just need very small amounts of some colors. And again, make sure that none of your paper edges are hanging out onto your ironing board, because you don't want to have sticky mess on your ironing board. And then this fabric is for the feet and the beak. You could leave these in one piece, but because of the design on this, I thought I'd play with it a little bit maybe. And then this is the yellow for the breast. Now, if you actually look up this bird, they have a very bright yellow, but I didn't want that yellow color to take over the whole design. So I used a little bit more muted yellow than what the actual bird has on their breast. And interestingly enough, in this species as well, the coloring for males and females is pretty much the same. I have 3 flowers on my hat here, but my flowers are a little bigger than the flowers that are on this fabric. So I'm going to do 6 of them all together. You need to be patient with the ironing if you're doing a larger applique, because there's definitely a fair amount of time spent holding the iron to fuse the pieces together. So those are all our pieces, and then we're going to cut them out. My pieces are all cut out, and we're ready to start the layering of the applique. There are times that I have done this directly onto the backing fabric and fused right to that fabric, but it is a little challenging to get everything lined up properly, especially when you have a more complicated design. And so a few years ago, I did a project and they recommended this. And this is called an applique fusing sheet. It is plastic, but it doesn't melt with the heat of the iron. And so you can use this to set up your whole piece and then move that as just one piece onto your backing. So I'm going to use that today. This is the template I used for tracing, the reversed template. But when you do this, you need the template in the position that you want your final drawing. And so this goes underneath my fusing sheet. That is my guideline when I start laying my pieces out. I will be fusing my pieces together on this sheet. I do what I would call a light fuse, not a full 10-second, and they will stick to the sheet, which is good because then they stay in place while I'm working on them, but you can peel it off the sheet. And if you get a piece a little bit out of position, you can peel it off and move it, although some of these will get fused to fabrics as we layer them. So I'm going to start out with pieces that are underneath other pieces, and I've already peeled my paper off on these. So the feet and the tail would be the next thing. And then I'm just going to touch them with my iron to stick them in place so they're not going to shift when I start adding other pieces. And literally it's like 1 or 2 seconds for that. So then the next piece is going to be this blue piece here, because other pieces are going to layer over top of it. Now I can't see the eye, so I can lift and get a sense of the position for the eye. So I'm going to just tap this side of it, and then I'm going to snip here, and I can peel the head up and slip that. And then again, this is where I can't see everything. So I'm going to just lift this up a little to check placement. So this one's going here. And then we can position the flowers, and I don't have set positions for these. So just thinking about this, I had in the drawing the front one was cut off a little bit by the hat brim. So I think I'm going to do a little trim on the edge of that. And there will be applique stitching along here as well, satin stitching. And now I'm going to do a little bit more of a solid fuse. And I still have a dry iron, because if you have steam on your iron when you do this on the plastic, it condenses and adds a lot of moisture, and I don't want that. I will use steam when I fuse this to the background. So like I said, this isn't the full 10-second solid fuse, but they should be together enough that I can carefully peel this off. And there's bird number 1, ready to be fused to the background. I haven't been showing you all the different parts that are going to make up this finished wall hanging, but I've got all of the other pieces fused on here, and I'm now ready to fuse my bird with the hat. So I've turned the quilt sideways because of the width of the ironing board. It's going to fit better. And I've positioned it where I want it. And I've looked at how far from the bottom the feet are and compared that to the bird on the opposite side. I actually, in this quilt, wanted some extension into this border that I already sewn on. A lot of quilts I don't do that, but this one I decided I would like that. I wanted it to happen at the top of the quilt as well, but when I got everything in place, nope, he's not tall enough, so it's okay. So now this fusing is the final fusing. This is going to stick this to the background to hold it in place while I'm stitching. And so I am going to use steam on my iron, which I did not use when the paper was still there, but the paper is all gone now. And we're going to be doing 8 to 10 seconds of pressure. And so again, it's not ironing, it's pressing. And if I feel like I'm not hearing steam, which I'm not, I might use my extra steam button because that steam is going to help make a more solid fuse. And sometimes I count in my head, 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. When I was working on the pieces earlier, it's a lot of pieces in this quilt, I would actually just sit the iron on it and then I'd start cutting other pieces out. It helps the time go a little quicker, and I would count in my head while I was cutting. And so you just do sections and I move my way up. Sometimes I'll do a quick once over just to get it stuck a little bit before I come back and do the 8-second, 10-second. My piece here isn't fusing. I can feel the web on it. So what's going on here? Sometimes when you're doing fusing like this, the iron is designed to shut off if it's not moving. And when you're holding it still for 10 seconds and not moving it very much, sometimes it will shut off while you're working. And I think that is what mine's done because the light's on. So I'm just going to give it a minute here to warm up again. By the way, even those of us who are maybe more of an expert than others make mistakes. And when I was doing all this applique, I stuck fusing web to my iron and I ironed on the right side of the fabric instead of the wrong side of the fabric. And all fixable, it's all good, but we all make mistakes when we're in this creative process. Giving it all a little bit more of a press just to make sure that it's all solid here. And so this is ready now to start the applique stitching. So one of the big questions when you start doing your stitching with the satin stitch is what color thread to use. And when I originally started this, I was kind of thinking that I would use different colors depending on the part that I was going around. So for example, on this yellow part, I might use yellow thread. Sometimes I go in that color, but I go with a darker yellow, so it stands out a little bit. And then other times I have gone with something like all black. And what I find with the black is that it brings out the details, especially in this design. The 2 shades of blue on the birds are not hugely different. But if I was to stitch around that with black, that would pull out those details and make them more obvious. So I'm actually thinking that I am going to use black for all of this one. And part of it also is because it is a wall hanging. And so I want people to be able to see the details from further back in the room and not just when they're up close to the design. And so to the sewing machine to get started on the stitching. Now, you'll have to set up with your own machine and how it works. On my machine, it's number 8, but what you want is just a standard zigzag. So the zigzag where the needle just goes back and forth to create the zigzag. And then when it comes to settings, my zigzag automatically comes on with a width of 5. I rarely do satin stitching with that wide of a setting. I often will do 3, and sometimes I'll do 2.5, sometimes I'll do 2, especially if the shape is a smaller shape. Now you also need to change your length. 1.5 is quite long, and it's going to look like a zigzag, not a satin stitch. I thought I would show you a comparison of densities of stitching. So here I've got my machine set on a regular zigzag, and the width on all of these for my machine is 3.0. So density, though, has to do with how close together the stitches are. So this one was set on 1.0, and then line number 2 is on 0.75, 3 is 0.5, 4 is 0.4, and 5 is 0.3. You can decide how dense you want your stitches. You definitely want to cover your edges so that they don't fray. And so the material you're using might be a factor in which you choose. If you want the more solid look, 0.3 is probably the better option. But usually I do 0.5. They're just a little further apart, but I'm doing a wall hanging, for example, right now. And from a distance, this is going to look pretty solid on my pieces. The other thing I think about is how long it takes to do. Probably the 0.3 is going to take me almost twice as long to stitch as a 0.5. So if you're doing a design with a lot of stitching, it's going to increase the amount of time you're spending. Now, that might not be a bad thing, but it might be something that you think about when you're doing it. So that's a comparison of the stitches. The other thing is you want to have stability because, and I'm going to exaggerate here. So I have this piece of fabric that I probably would never use for applique. It's also a single layer and it's pretty thin. There's no stabilizer or anything, because what you don't want when you're stitching, and I'll just show you what's going to happen here. And this is still set on 0.3 right now, but you can see how it's pulling up in the center there. And even if change that to 0.5, it's still pulling it in the center. So I could play with tension to try and get that to flatten out. But with this particular fabric, I don't think I probably ever would get a good result with just the single layer of this fabric. I would need to do something to stabilize it in order to keep that stitching flat. And so this one, I actually have fused another piece of fabric on the back. So there's a layer of the fusing web in between this. And usually I find that's enough stability. But if you were using thinner fabrics, you might need to add something else. You might need to iron in a layer of interfacing, for example, or you might use a tearaway stabilizer, or sometimes even a piece of tissue paper on the bottom that you rip off later will work. Probably when you do your applique, you might want to do a sample with the fabrics you're actually going to be working with, just to make sure you get your settings and you know that it's going to work. Now, I've done a lot of applique, a lot of it's just on cottons, and so I generally know how it's going to act, and I don't very often do samples anymore. But it is a good idea to do a sample before you start. Something else to be aware of when you're doing applique stitching, if you're going to be switching from one width to another while you're progressing down an edge, you need to know something about your machine. So I've got my machine set on 3 right now. So I'm going to switch to 2.5, and I could do 2.9, 2.8, but just for the purposes here. So 2.5, and then to 2, and 1.5. So when you look at that, you see how it's centered all the way down? Not every sewing machine will do that. Some sewing machines will stitch on one side. When you switch the widths, it always lines up on that line as it goes. So what you end up with is kind of a staggered looking stitch as you go down. And so you have to make slight movements to adjust for that if you're going to be changing the width of your stitch while you're sewing. So you need to know that about your machine, and you can do what I just did, stitch a sample to see how your stitch acts. And then probably if you're going to do any type of applique stitching where you are doing this kind of adjustment, practice is a good thing. Just a review of the sewing machine feet options for applique. So this is the foot that comes with the machine. It's the standard sewing foot. If I was going to sew a garment or something like that, I would use this foot. I have done applique with this foot, but it has some limitations. One of the big ones is that it's difficult to see exactly what you're doing. And so I find that I'm stopping and putting my needle down and kind of peeking under the foot to try and see and make sure that I'm sewing in the correct position. So this is not a foot today that I would use. Another option is the clear view foot, and a lot of machines come with this foot. It's actually designed for decorative stitching, so it works really well for things like applique, because on the bottom it has these metal plates and they're very smooth. And so it lets the foot move over the fabric more smoothly when you're doing stitching that's quite close together. So that's a great foot if you have that one. But if you have it, even better is an applique foot. And the only real difference here is that the center has been removed, so it gives me really great visibility to guide my machine where I want it to go when I'm stitching. So I'm going to pop up a picture here so you can see where I'm at on this project. I've got my sewing machine stitched and I've got 3 of the birds stitched, and I am now going to work on the bird that I was showing you when I was doing the cutting and the pressing of the applique. And so I'll show you the different stitch widths that I'm going to be using and why I choose different options at different times. And so I am going to use the density at 0.5 from the ones that I was showing you. Generally, when I have layered pieces like this where some parts are in the foreground and some are more in the background, I like to start with the things that are in the background. So this foot, for example, is underneath the breast of the bird. And so I start with that. Now, sometimes I miss and I do something that's on top of something else before I do the underneath piece. And honestly, with the applique, it doesn't really show when I do that, but I just like to try not to. Now, like I said, normally I use a 3 setting, but because this has so many different pieces and some of them are quite small, I have been mostly using a 2 or a 2.5. Now, I don't go below 2 very much because it's hard to cover the edge of the fabric if the zigzag is too narrow. So I'm going to do these feet on 2 because there's not a lot of width in the piece there. And your stitching should be right always on the fabric that has the fusing web. So this is giving that extra stability. So I'm not using anything underneath this to stabilize it further. But I did find as I was working with this that this gray fabric is lighter than the blue that I have further up here. And so I do have to watch a little more closely to make sure that it doesn't start kind of bunching up on me. So I use my hands, and sometimes I'm just gently pulling just to hold the fabric flat. And you also want to make sure that your needle is sharp. So I'm going to use this lock button so it stitches in one place when it's locking rather than going back and forth. If you don't have a lock button, you could just pull your threads to the back and knot them later. I have sometimes used reverse, but then you get that extra darkness because you've got layers of thread there. When the needle came up, the needle moved over to the left. And I want my thread to be on the edge of the fabric when the needle is on the right. So I'm not going to start all over. I can just take this and just slightly move it over. And now I'm going to lower my needle to see exactly where that is, and that's going to be okay. And now when I stitch, the needle, when it comes on the right side, should be right along the edge of the fabric. And I'm also setting my needle so it's always going to stop down because I need that a lot with this. So basically I'm using the techniques that I was showing in the simple appliques, turning corners, curves, that kind of thing. And it's just applied to a more differentiated shape. So there's more curves of different types here. So I do a little pivot here, and the needle for this pivot is on the left side. And now needle's on the right side because I'm pivoting the other way a little bit. needle on the right to go around this curve. Now you can use your hand wheel for some of this. I'm pretty good with my machine, and it really is all about getting to know your machine. So there's the first foot, and then I'm going to do the other one. So tail I'm going to do at 2.5, and I'm being consistent here with what I did with the other birds when I was stitching them. And then next I have a line right here that I'm going to stitch. Then we'll go up the outside of the wing. And then this little section right here. You can see here, sometimes I sew so that the needle needs to be on the left, to be on the edge of the fabric. Other times it'll be the other way. And if you're more comfortable with one side versus the other, you can just turn your fabric and come at it from the other direction. And I do tend to stitch more often so the needle's coming down on the right side of the fabric rather than the left, but I can do it both ways. So I'm going to do this darker part of the wing right here, and I'm going to do the inside part of it on 2 and the outside part of it on 2.5. Although at the bottom here, you'll see what I do when I get there. So I'm going to start on 2, right down at the bottom tip. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make that 1.5 because the tip comes together at a point there, and 2 is going to cover it. So I think we'll do 1.5 there. And I'm going to come about 1 centimeter or ½ an inch or so, and then go to the 2. This is where this smooth edge on the bottom of the foot comes in handy, because on curves that aren't very sharp, sometimes I can just manipulate around the curve as I'm stitching. Now we're coming around the top, and it's a little wider at the top, so I'm going to go to 2.5. Now I'm coming into the narrower part here, so I'm going to go back to 2. And now to 1.5. There, I'm going to do the beak next. I'm doing the beak on 2. And at the point, I'm going to 1.5. And back to 2. Now I'm going to do the eye. Now this one's tricky because it's half of an eye. And I did do the outer red part on 2 for the other birds, because I find with the 1.5, if you're not very careful, you don't catch enough of the fabric. I felt like it looked messy. I actually tried 1.5 and I didn't really like how it looked. So I am using the 2. I'm losing a bit of the effect of the red because of that, because it's covering up some of it. If I was going to do it over, I probably wouldn't have put the black on at all, and I would have stitched this, and then I just would have done a little bit of satin stitching in the center with thread for the black part rather than using the fabric. But I already had it all fused, so I just dealt with it the way it was. Lots of pivoting getting around this. And for this center part, it's such a small bit that's showing. I'm going to 1.5 and I'm just going to stitch across there. I'm not even going to try and shape it. So for the hat, I've drawn in a line that is part of the design on the hat. And I'm going to actually zigzag on that line. Sometimes I do details on the interior in a straight stitch, but it depends how distinct I want them to be. And so this is kind of a major line on the hat, so I'm going to zigzag it. Oh, and I'm going to use 2. I used 2 for all the clothing on the other birds as well. So I've got the hat outlined here. So now I'm going to work on some of the ribbon. You can see some of my fusing hasn't stuck, and I could go back to the iron and refuse that, but there's enough that's fused in place that it's not going to move while I'm stitching, and my stitching is now going to hold it. So I'm not going to go and fuse it. I will be ironing this when I'm all done, just to flatten out all the stitching. So now I just have the flowers left, and I had debated about doing all of the edges on them or just doing something in the center. I think I'm going to do all the edges just to be consistent. So we'll start again with ones that are underneath others, and I'm going to continue using the 2 for the width. So I'm going to be trimming all these threads, and I've been using my thread cutter, and I often am not a fan because there's all these little threads on the back and it's lots of cutting, especially if your thread really matches and it's hard to see them. But this is the top of a quilted wall hanging, and so that's all going to get covered up, and so I don't need to cut those threads, but I will cut the ones on the top. So here's our completed center panel for my applique wall hanging, and everything has been stitched and pressed, and I'm ready to add on the final borders and finish this up. And you can always add in more details if you want. You could have stitched lines here to show the gathers, but I sometimes with applique prefer a suggestion rather than an exact design. There is one other thing I need to put in this, and that is the thread that's running through, and all of the birds are going to get a little piece of the thread. It's not going to be exactly following a good path here, but I think I'm going to leave that and put that in when I actually quilt this, so that that will be stitched in place as part of my quilt stitching on the final design.